I think that came from the music, from the bebop and hip hop. In bebop, you can play within an outside solo and you can quote the standard, weave it in there, and you're not playing the standard, but you're referring to it. And hip hop takes things from many sources. So a lot of those things came in there. Certainly the samurai, as well as things from films in Seijun Suzuki, a Japanese director of gangster films in the 60s. Those are words from director Jim Jarmusch on his 1999 film Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer. And each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia Maroney, and today we're talking about Ghost Dog. So quick synopsis of the film is an African-American mafia hitman who models himself after the samurai of old finds himself targeted for death by the mob. Tagline for the film is, all assassins live beyond the law. Only one follows the code. The film stars Forrest Whitaker as Ghost Dog, John Tormey as Louis, Cliff Gorman as Sonny Valerio, Henry Silva as Ray Vargo, and Isaac de Bacalet as Raymond. It's written by Jim Jarmusch, cinematography by Robbie Mueller, directed by Jim Jarmusch, edited by Jay Rabinowitz, music by RZA, and costumes by John Dunn. Today, my guest is Rolo Tony, and you should recognize him from our episode on Woman Under the Influence for my Cassavetes series. So highly recommend you go back and listen to that if you haven't already. So I won't have him reintroduce himself, but before we get into the film, I just want to say thanks so much for coming back on the show. I'm very excited to have you back on.
Thank you so much for having me back, Felicia. I'm excited to get into it. Big Jarmusch fan. This podcast, it's a pleasure. I love the tone. I love the vibe of these kinds of conversations. So, yeah, I'm ready to jump into it.
Nice. Before we get into Ghost Dog, which is what we're actually talking about today, I'm hoping that you can recommend 2 to 3 films that you've watched in the past couple of weeks or so that you think the listener should add to their watch list.
Of course. So I've been, as usual, I watch a lot of things, a lot of wide reaches of strange, bizarro stuff. And I guess the first thing I would want to touch on is Frank Henenlotter's Brain Damage. Sometimes I save horror films for October, right? But then other times I get into the mood for, a good, solid, gory, violent movie, right? And Brain Damage, that was a surprising one for me because I knew Henenlotter made films with a fair amount of comedy, but this was kind of like a pitch black comedy, one that makes you like viscerally upset and depressed throughout, right? Rather than like the usual gore you would expect from someone who made Basket Case, right? It's about this guy who essentially encounters this parasite that feeds off of the brains of humans. And when he puts them on the back of his head, this creature gives him this unbelievable high, right? So it becomes this almost like heightened PSA from the 80s about like, don't do drugs, not even once, right? But it has this like really dark, sardonic writing to it. Frank Zackerly, the old horror host, is it Frank Zackerly? Zackerly is his last name, regardless. He's the voice of the creature. I like to think that there's this double meaning where it's saying not only are drugs rotting your brain, but so are horror movies. The next thing next movie I wanted to talk about, I should say, is One from the Heart, the reprise. Francis Ford Coppola just put that out, 4K restoration. Yeah, the interesting thing about Coppola is he's known for essentially his form-defining texts, right? Like when you go to like film school and you go and you learn about the classics, you watch Apocalypse Now, you watch Godfather, you watch The Conversation, right? These are movies that like, while they bend with the form a bit, right? They've become like these classic archetypes of what you can or cannot do with the medium, right? But what's interesting with his misses, right? I guess you could classify Rumblefish as a miss, but like at the same time, it's such a well-regarded film, right?
Yeah.
You can even talk about like Tetro, right? Or Twixt, right? Some of his more recent stuff. But then to bring it back to One from the Heart, and this reprise edition specifically, right? Like I feel like there was quite a bit changed from like the original to this new reprise, right? And it's interesting to see Coppola now as he's gearing up to make Megalopolis. Like he's in his George Lucas era, right? And like this One from the Heart reprise opens with like a CGI credit sequence. The interesting thing with this movie now, as it exists in 2024, is that while Coppola gives us the ideas of what these scenes were supposed to be, right? Not all of the footage is there. The One from the Heart that he tries to construct with the footage that he has simply cannot exist, right? And what's most interesting with me in this reprise, right, is the original was so much more musical. It was so much more like people would just break into song, dances in the streets, etc., right? And then there was so much more of a reliance on the recorded soundtrack with Tom Waits, and I forget the female singer he's singing with as well, woman singer, woman artist. Regardless, what I'm saying is there is more of a canned feel to it, right? It feels more melodramatic than it does musical. And while I appreciate the difference in tone, and I think I would have preferred the movie that Coppola presents in 2024, I don't think that the material's there. So what's interesting is we now have these two versions of One from the Heart, right? We have one that's halfway a musical, halfway a melodrama, and they're both not quite complete, but both have their own pluses and minuses. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see how people mull over that as time goes along.
I agree. He's a very interesting director because he's got a string of huge films, and then after a certain time, people just kind of didn't talk about his work. But even before the first Godfather was like Rain People that people don't talk about. And I watched that for the first time not too long ago. I really liked it. It's very of the time. And I don't know that people would resonate with it now, but it's interesting to see what he's capable of. But someone also who we're actually talking about today has something that he's, I think, currently filming. I don't know if he's fully filmed it or if he's even started yet, but I know he's got something in the works, and he's also hasn't worked, or he hasn't been putting out any narrative features for a bit. Jarmusch, do you recall the first time you watched Ghost Dog and what your initial thoughts were on that first watch?
So I got into Ghost Dog probably in like 2006 or 7. I was into the video store phase, right? That all children go through, right? Like I was really into like going in there, rating whatever I had seen in a magazine or in some kind of early internet form as like formative films. And I got into Quentin Tarantino, obviously, right? And, when you watch Kill Bill 1 and 2, right? You hear all about the RZA's production on the soundtrack, right? And you hear all of these great needle drops, right? And I think that Kill Bill is a movie that like half works because of its soundtrack. And when I was young, I loved it. I downloaded it to my phone, what have you. And it was from that I started to get really into the Wu-Tang Clan's music, as well as the RZA as a personality. And it was actually that led me to Coffee and Cigarettes, which then got me into Jarmusch as a larger filmmaker. When I come down to Jarmusch as a filmmaker and how I got into his movies, definitely Ghost Dog was my first one. It was one that kind of set the tone in a lot of ways. And it's an easy gateway, I find. But what I find interesting is that throughout his career, he has so many different kinds of modes. And Ghost Dog occupies a specific type of story he likes to tell that I would like to get into further as we continue.
For sure. That's so interesting that Ghost Dog was your first. I think that's the first person I've met that Ghost Dog is, because I think it's so specific. Mm-hmm. So I am definitely interested to hear more about your thoughts on that. But obviously you loved Ghost Dog and you explored more of his work. Do you want to talk about kind of your relationship to his other films before we get into more of Ghost Dog?
So with Down by Law was another one of those movies that when you're looking through these lists, right, sometimes you see the big ones, right? You see that, oh, okay, here's Stranger Than Paradise. This is his first film. It really put him on the map. Or you see Broken Flowers here. Oh, this one's got Bill Murray in it, right? I look at Down by Law, right? And it's got Roberto Benigni and Tom Waits, black and white prison movie. Yeah, I really want to watch that. And then as I keep going through Jarmusch's filmography, right, what I find sets him apart from his contemporaries is that he never blew up. He knew his lane and he stood in it. And it's not because he has any feeling of superiority or any kind of, essentially he's keeping himself contained as a exercise rather in restraint and creativity rather than he is somebody who's looking to goes too far outside of his reach. Only Lovers Left Alive has a documentary on it called Traveling at Night with Jim Jarmusch. And I remember when that came out, I was obsessed with it because it's a lot of B-roll footage of Jarmusch working with Tilda Swinton, Mia Wasikowski. I've been terrible with pronunciations today. My apologies.
I am also pretty bad with her last name, so no worries.
But that movie in particular, right? I feel like that one and Ghost Dog are almost like pairs in terms of story structure. And I find that Jarmusch as a filmmaker, he's someone who really does such a great job of putting you inside the mind of the characters' perspective, while you're also aware of the influences that come outside and shape them. You're not meant to be with them 100% along on the ride, but rather totally understand how they got to where they are now and where they're going to go in the future, and also understand how the environment that they're in changes and molds them as time goes along.
I think that's actually the best way to put it. It's very much about the characters and the influences. And I was doing research on his work, and the common thread is that his stuff is more about the characters and the plot itself, because often there's not really much of a plot. There is one in this film. I think so, versus something like a Mystery Train. But it's more so about the characters, and he's very good at writing characters, and that's a strength.
What's interesting is you say this one has the most plot, right? But I think it's interesting to point out that he mostly makes comedies. Even if something is billed as a drama, there is a strong streak of humor. And what was interesting when I was watching that aforementioned B-roll documentary with Only Lovers Left Alive, he's often destroying his dialogue. His dialogue as written will change completely when he arrives on set and things just go out the window, right? He goes wherever things feel most natural and most comedic and funny. And I think that's best actually exemplified in Ghost Dog, because the structure is really familiar.
I think people on the outside, the best way to say that, people who are familiar with his name, maybe have seen a couple, think that he's very serious. But whenever I think of Jarmusch, I always think he's a bit silly, and that there are comedies. It's just that people think that his films are slow or maybe boring, so they just don't associate that with comedy. But it's one, you look at the cast, that alone, but also there's a lot of comedic moments, even in Ghost Dog. So, I can't think of a single film of his that doesn't have a comedic undertone.
He's so observant, right? I feel like he takes these little pieces of things that he either experiences in his life or he reads about or he watches, right? And rather than some filmmakers like a Tarantino who would just copy it, I think he really internalizes it and intellectualizes it in a very interesting way. So some directors like a Tarantino, right, they know it like an encyclopedic knowledge, right? But then with Jarmusch, it's more of an emotional truth, right? He'll feel things out. And a lot of people, they'll look at someone like a Jarmusch or even a Tom Waits or a Nick Cave, and they'll view them as impenetrable artists, right? They're they're atop this wall. When in reality, if you were to meet them in person, they probably would just be the sad drunk in the corner, or the person who would be telling stories at a get together. These are normal people, right? And I think that in the process of trying to understand art, we should demystify these legends and see them as people, right? Because that's what Jarmusch is even trying to do with his work, right? Jarmusch is not asking you to mythologize Ghost Dog in a crazy way. You're supposed to see him as a normal person living life the right way.
I think that's exactly that. And I that's why I've always resonated with Jarmusch's work, because I think he is, as much as he's someone who has all these huge famous friends and has made these films with all these casts and has consistently been able to work since film school, he still seems like just a regular dude, and he seems so accessible, which is, I think, the best type of artist, in my opinion.
I think I've nailed it. I just thought of it now, and I'm surprised I've never heard of this before. Jim Jarmusch is the filmmaking equivalent of Anthony Bourdain.
Yes. They also kind of look alike.
Exactly, right? White hair, all poked
Yeah.
up, right? Yeah, but the smoking tons of cigarettes, right?
Yeah.
But it also in life philosophy, right? Because like
Mm.
Bourdain was someone who was known who would travel all these crazy places, right? And he would try all these different kinds of cuisines and foods. And he was someone who was obsessed with enriching himself in culture. And Jarmusch is very much the same way, right? And especially in his later films, as he starts to get bigger budgets, bigger names, he becomes
Hmm.
interested in this idea of like cross-culturalism, the idea of like what a genre or what a tone or what a theme means to different countries, backgrounds, races, religions, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very interesting thing and a classy way of handling it between each film. They're treated with conversations rather than platitudes. Symbolism is there, but it's not the focus. It's the moment to moment character development that is left with the most resonance.
I mean, I think that's the perfect segue into getting into the film because all those things that you just mentioned are huge themes in this film itself. So if you're ready to get into Ghost Dog, I am. One of the first things I want to talk about is kind of when you're getting into, at this point, the 90s, there's been genres that we've seen throughout history in film that were very prevalent in certain eras. And then once they pass those eras, they're kind of considered like, even if we think about a noir, we got the 30s and 40s noirs, everything post that is considered a neo-noir or a reconstruction of a noir. And we get that with gangster films and we get that with samurai films. In this film, it's considered a deconstruction of both those genres and he's reconstructing those genres, making them, you could say, more modern, but he is putting his own spin on it. I think he's still very cognizant of those genres and he's not trying to reconstruct them fully. I think he's just putting his own spin on it by making the characters more relatable and honest. How do you feel about, before we get into the nitty gritty of those genres and how he does it, how you feel about his version of, not only melding the two genres, but his version of it in Ghost Dog?
Yeah, so it's interesting that there are these two different genres within it, right? The mob film and the samurai film, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to start with the samurai film because that's the most prevalent. That's Ghost Dog's story. It's the most appropriate to talk about. So when it comes down to it, we see all of these martial arts, Japanese cinema influenced films. I brought up Tarantino before with Kill Bill, and then also the RZA himself went on to make The Man with the Iron Fist, right? And the common theme with all of these filmmakers who come back to like martial arts, kung fu films from that era is they always go the campy route. They always go like the heightened, we're going to go silly with it. And I think that like beyond like Melville with like Le Samurai, right? Like there aren't many directors who went the Kurosawa, Zatoichi route, right? In the samurai story. And I think that was absolutely the right decision to go in. And I'll explain a bit further after I get to the mobster stuff, because the mobster stuff's very important. The reason it's important is because all of these mobsters, right, are pathetic and sad and showboating. And when it comes to how they present themselves, it's out of step with the times. People often talk about how modern filmmakers, they like to eschew doing contemporary stories. But I think that by having Ghost Dog set in present day, it makes the mobster stuff so much funnier, so much more impactful, because essentially these are people who are being phased out. These are people who are no longer apart with the times. And with the genre itself, right, mobster movies aren't really on the rise, right? And what Jarmusch is alluding to with this film, right, he's talking about like almost a new wave of Black artists almost. And you see that with the RZA's inclusion, with the young girl who's reading the books. So you have these confluences, right? And the last thing to get back to the samurai point compared to the mobster is with cross-culturalism, the film isn't trying to make a point whether or not somebody should or should not consume one thing or another from a different country, what have you. Instead, what it's interested in is why you consume something, how you consume something, and how it imprints upon the rest of your life, right? And the implication here is these mobsters, they say they have a code, but all they do is they watch Looney Tunes cartoons, right? And they're emotionally vapid. And when they listen to music, they're listening to hip hop because it's better than anything else on the radio. It's great music. And then when it comes to Ghost Dog and his journey, He's taken up a code. He's taken up an honor, and he's into his books. He's into his code, and he lives by that. And he has close friendships, and he lives a happier, fuller life. And when you see his observations of, let's say, the kids in the park doing the freestyle rapping, or even when he bumps into the RZA specifically, I think that there is a knowing choice here to say that the life of like the New York rapper is almost the same as like a Japanese poet in feudal Japan. And I think that's like frankly genius. I think that's a great idea from Jarmusch's end. What do you think about that?
I mean, I agree. I think it also with the rewatch, you get more of it too, because there's so much going on in this film. And if you're watching it for the first time, you might feel maybe confused, overwhelmed by what he's trying to do. But on rewatches, I was able to have a greater appreciation for what he's doing, because I think it takes so much talent and also just people's respect to be like, this man's not co-opting or appropriating anyone's culture. I think he's celebrating it, and he's showing that people can celebrate other people's cultures without it feeling awkward or appropriative, because I don't think anyone thinks that Ghost Dog is appropriating. I think he's so in tune with it that it's so involved. And the same with, I was glad that you brought up one of the gangsters, Vinny, or no, it was Sonny rapping. Yeah, the Flava Flav song. And I just thought that was so fun, because it's like, yeah, why can't he listen to rap? Just because, he's an Italian gangster doesn't mean that he doesn't, resonate with that. So that you see that throughout a lot of Jarmusch's films, because he's really big on music. He loves music, but he's so well-rounded in all the films, because I've been going back and rewatching it. And throughout even like Coffee and Cigarettes, you get your jazz, you get your hip hop, you get your, rock and roll, and he just loves all of it. And it's just such a great way to meld everything together and just appreciate art. So I think that's what this film is, an appreciation of art and different cultures.
100%. And I want to touch on that mobster who was singing Public Enemy one more time, right? Because I think that's a really interesting detail in this film, in the sense that like all of those gangsters are, dropping the N-word and like profiling all kinds of different people as their race, right? The Italian characters in this film, that's what they do, right? They see race first and go from there, right? And what's so interesting is that they have so many negative things to say about Black people, but then in private, they're listening to their music. That's genius, right? Like, and when it comes to what they consume, what have you, goes from there. And I think what's also interesting is early on, the film really lets you in on what kind of mood and what pace it's going to be. And I didn't catch it until this time around, like you were saying with the rewatching. You get that pigeon flying in, and I never noticed this before, and I felt like an idiot, but when I saw it, I couldn't stop laughing. The pigeon's wings are in time with the percussion of the RZA's beats.
Are they?
Yeah, so very early on, right, you've got those wings lulling you into the beat of the percussion, then you come into the crossfades over the skyline, right? And there's so many crossfades. There's so many like slow, like, we're going to transition here. We're going to go there, right? There's a floating feel to everything. And then the RZA's beats are just like softly moving you along. It's a complex film, right? But it really lulls you into comfort first, because you really need to get into the Zen nature of Ghost Dog. And, I think we got to talk about Forrest Whitaker, because like Forrest Whitaker is amazing in this movie.
Oh, yeah. I think he's what really pulls you into the story, because again, if you're not familiar with Jarmusch's work and this style of characters that he creates, you might be like, what's going on with this guy? Because I was reading Roger Ebert's criticism of it. He does like the film, but he thinks that Ghost Dog is absolutely insane, and not in necessarily a demeaning way, but he thinks he's absolutely an insane person. And I was like, yeah, I could see how people would read that, but I don't think so. I think he's just so confident. And I think that people find that off-putting when someone is so assured of who they are, because most of us are not. So when you find someone who's like, this is who I am, I already know this, you're just like, oh, this person is weird, but they're not. So I think that he's great. And I really, really appreciated his performance on this rewatch, because what I love about this story is not only does it, Jarmusch has a Black man as lead who is so in tune to samurai culture, Japanese culture, which we don't see ever. but he's also a bigger and kind of domineering presence, which most people would just see as violent or would have fear towards. And he's the opposite of that. He's someone, everyone he interacts with has so much respect and love for him. Even if they think he's a bit weird, they're just like, they find him very soothing. And you see him interact with not only himself, his pigeons, or just the way he walks and navigates the world. He seems very, I don't know if teddy bear is the best term, but sort of like that, like so very soft.
Yeah.
And you're like, I feel safe with this person. And it's because of his performance, because another actor of the same stature might not have given off that performance. So I really love what he did with this, because he makes Ghost Dog seem like you're on his side immediately. Doesn't matter what he's doing. If you see him, breaking into cars, or, he's doing a job where he's literally killing someone, where you're like, well, he's doing a job for a reason, So that's how I feel about his performance.
I love what you said about him being a bigger guy, right? Like you do get the impression early on, like, oh, he could probably really like mess somebody up. But then when you see him alone practicing his, I almost called them dance moves, because that's what they feel like. When he's practicing his choreography, right? Like he's got a smile on his face. He's very fluid, and the music is perfect, pitch perfect, like really highlighting the joy. And the thing with Ebert's review that made me laugh when you just told me that was that to me, I think that he forgot it was a comedy, right? He forgot that we're supposed to be laughing with Ghost Dog a lot of the way. Like, yes, there is this contemplation. There's this, methodical nature in which he takes care of his jobs. But like the first time we see him do any crime, he goes to break into a car. So he pulls out that fob or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And he bends down, right? He goes to like lean next to the car door. And Jarmusch put like a sound effect of like wind going down, right?
Yeah.
Like when he's moving a sword around. So like immediately that should be a tip to anyone, right? Okay, if they're doing sound effects as he's like bending down, you're supposed to be laughing with a lot of the things he's doing. And with Whitaker, when you listen to him speak about his process, right, as an actor, he is like almost like a method light, I would call, right? Like he does like methody stuff. But I wouldn't call him a method actor. And what I mean by that is like, with Charlie Parker, he got really enveloped into the music, really put himself in the headspace for that role in particular. And then for something like Ghost Dog, right? Like he's really reading these texts. He's really getting into all of this stuff. And then he's also really into like the music. Like I keep on bringing it back to the music, but one thing I kept on hearing about him in interviews is like he really likes the Wu-Tang Clan, likes the RZA, was understood like rap music. And I really feel as though rap music and this samurai subcultures are really being brought into one another. Yeah. And with Ghost Dog as well, as portrayed by Forrest Whitaker, he's an actor who has so much stillness and he controls so much with his gaze. And a scene will be playing out in front of him and you will know whether you should be scared or where you should be laughing just based on how he's looking at them. And I think that's the mark of a fantastic talent. It's one of the reasons why Forrest Whitaker is one of my favorite actors. He's got physicality unlike anybody else.
I can't imagine anyone else in this role, because I think this could have gone any other way, but I think he's really good at making this character so memorable and personable. And you really want to follow him throughout his journey. And I feel like I was on board with every decision that he makes, even if it results in his physical downfall in the end. With the music, though, that's really interesting, because obviously we mentioned Jarmusch is really big on music, and this character is really big on music. He has a device, he said, to break into cars, but he's always carrying his little suitcase that has a whole CD case in it. So he's always popping in those CDs. I love the CDs every time they come up. It's always different music, but it's one of the time, because it's still, this is 99 it came out. So you would be popping in a CD into your car, which we don't get anymore. We don't have any cassette or CD slots anymore. So I think that whatever CDs, and like you and I would have been still of the time where we had CDs, obviously. And if you had a case that you had, it kind of matched who you were, and it was your personality to be like, this is who I am. These are the music, the musicians I listen to, and he has all this. How do you feel about that kind of being an extension of that character's personality?
Well, I think the first detail that always makes me laugh whenever he brings out those CDs is he's wearing the white latex gloves, so he doesn't
Yeah.
get any fingerprints on it. Like, awesome, perfect. And also when it comes to those sleeves, like I had a bunch of those in my car growing up, could go on all day about the nostalgia I hold for DVD and CD cases. But when it comes to the music that he's listening to in the car itself, I was writing down all the genres as he was going, right? He starts off with rap and then he continues on. He listens to reggae, he listens to the blues, and he listens to jazz. These are all predominantly, Black dominated music, right? Or should I say genres? Yeah, genres. The idea of Ghost Dog, right? This is just like the 90s version of what a Black man in New York is going through. So that's why he's listening to rap, rap music is the tone around it, right? That's why Wu-Tang Clan is kind of this thing, because they were huge at that exact time. Not so much a stylistic choice done for the reasons that Tarantino does it, right? Because Tarantino does it because he has a love, blaxploitation in Jackie Brown, right? That was exactly what he did just a couple of years before Ghost Dog, and both of these films are similar in that way. But again, Tarantino is more so focused on like getting the opening credits exactly the same versus Jarmusch trying to get like, how are things different from back then and how can they now meld with one another? And I think that's a much more interesting question.
I think that's why his work has been able to sustain itself, because he's a filmmaker that, I don't know what, I feel like it's maybe, I don't know how you feel about separating yourself from what you know and like what the average person on the street knows. Like, does the average person know who Jarmusch is? Because everyone I know, but everyone I know is into film. So I just assume that people at least know his name. And so he's well known enough, but he has a tight enough filmography. Like, he doesn't have 20, 30 films he's working with. He's got a tight enough filmography that he's very specific with what he's creating. And I think that's why he's able to have these films that are celebrated, and as they grow with time and age, they're even more celebrated. Because I was rewatching this, and I completely forgot it was a 90s movie, thinking it was further into the 2000s, because it just didn't, there is 90s elements, but it seemed less of the, that 99 vibe, because there was a very strong 99 vibe with a lot of other films. I don't know how you feel about that, if it felt a little bit more modern.
I think it's like calling its shots, right? It kind of knows where the culture is going, and it's essentially pointing towards that. And we watched as it happened, and it's funny because this movie is shot at like the exact same time as The Sopranos, right? And I feel like you could make a lot of parallels to how the mobsters in this film go versus the Sopranos mobsters. But when it comes to Jarmusch as a filmmaker, being like a known brand or a known quantity, I think that there are some things that are pros and cons for his legacy. And at the end of the day, what does a legacy matter, right? Like, I think that all that matters is like, the work. But the problem with Jarmusch, right, is he makes movies that your grandmother imagines foreign language films are like. Like, he makes movies that are like just people sitting in rooms staring at each other, right? Like jokes that like you will only get if you get the themes, right? So like, I think he's really like an artisanal choice, if I could say that, like he's like he's the top shelf filmmakers in sense of like, if you're looking for someone who's going to be an American filmmaker trying to get at something more substantial, he's going to be one of your better options. He's not exactly, the most profound filmmaker, but in American cinema, he's probably one of the most contemplative. He's probably one of the most considerate. And when it comes to his modern films, right, if we're talking about this idea of getting into his stuff and all that, I think that like right now, his modern work has been kind of in a weird place. I feel like he's kind of going through an identity crisis. I think The Dead Don't Die, I saw that one at an advanced screening, and I felt like it just did not, it felt like a filmmaker lost. Like, he was trying to do a lot of the things he did in Ghost Dog, and then he kind of made it like transparently silly, which I think kind of ruined a lot of, I will say this word, but it doesn't necessarily fit, sentimentality in Ghost Dog. I think that there's a lot of heart in Ghost Dog, right? And I feel like as Jarmusch gets older, he becomes more interested in the text. He becomes more interested in how things literally mean versus the emotional through line.
I think that makes sense. Where he changed there, he did get right in something like a Patterson, where it was more of the heart and what he's good at. And I think it's some of his best writing is in Patterson. And same with Ghost Dog as well. So speaking on that, because it reminded me of something else I wanted to chat about, was the concept of loneliness and how it relates to this film. But I think it's a theme that runs throughout his films. I think a lot of the characters seem lonely on the outside because they're kind of isolated, or they have very niche interests. Like you could watch something like a Patterson, and you think that those characters are lonely, but they're not. They're very fulfilled because they're really interested in what they're doing. Same with Ghost Dog. Everyone in the film thinks that he's a loner, and they like, you have no friend, you don't talk to anyone. But he's like, I'm very happy and fulfilled, and I do have a best friend, even though I can't communicate with him. But I think that's what makes the friendship even more full. And he forms a friendship with a young girl that, they bond over books. So the concept of loneliness as it relates to the way people view Ghost Dog versus the characters like the gangsters who are actually lonely, but probably don't think they are because they're all surrounded together, but they're not talking to each other. There's no communication. They're just kind of sitting in rooms waiting for something to happen. How do you feel about those two parallels and how loneliness relates to them?
Yeah, I think that Ghost Dog is oddly enough a movie about like learning how to be happy by yourself. Well, he kind of already understands that. I think you start the movie with him being happy by himself, but then he learns the appreciation of reaching out more, because that communication he has with the girl at the park and their friendship over books, that's something that's born out of curiosity. And what Ghost Dog appreciates out of that conversation or relationship is understanding. And that's all he wants from any kind of communication or connection. With the ice cream man, though he speaks a different language, they understand each other. And actually, I just want to go on a bit of a tangent on the ice cream man. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I love that detail of the French and the English clashing. And I know that there are subtitles for it, but every time I watch it, I leave the subtitles off. I prefer being in Ghost Dog's world. But did you ever find out, do you know like the history behind that or why that might have been the case? Like why that character was written that way?
From what I've read, I think it was just so to prove that he is so in tune with humanity that he doesn't need to, because even some of the text that he's reading, I'm sure at first he probably didn't understand, but he was learning to gravitate towards it and form his own understanding of it. I think that's how he is with Raymond, the ice cream man. And they have such a beautiful relationship. They play chess together. They talk to each other, and they're both talking, knowing that neither of them really understands each other. And one of my favorite scenes is when they go watch that man who's building the boat together. And it's just like, you see the beauty in both, their reactions to it, because they do have an understanding. At least that's how I viewed why he kept it in French, his character, because that actor is obviously able to speak English, and you said you don't watch it with the subtitles, which I think is very interesting to watch that character. Unfortunately, I speak French, so I would still be able to understand what he's saying, but I think that would be very interesting to watch, with the way Ghost Dog is listening to it, because I think you still get at what he's trying to communicate to him. Which 100%. Is a testament to the actor also.
Yeah, they're essentially echoing one another. They have similar sentiments, and you can feel that in the way that they communicate. But I was doing research on Jarmusch, and I was listening to him talking about making Down by Law. And he was talking about how he was this judge on a panel in an Italian film festival, and he worked with Roberto Benigni on that panel. And everyone else at the panel kind of disagreed with each other, and they all kind of splintered off. And Jarmusch and Benigni became fast friends this way. But the interesting thing was that Benigni spoke Italian and he spoke English, right? But what was the language that they both knew that they spoke? French. So in my mind, right, I think that this Ice Cream Man character, right, is actually a sly reference to his friendship with Roberto Benigni. And I think that makes the Ghost Dog relation with him too, just that little, it gives it an oomph.
I didn't realize he spoke French too. That makes more sense because it comes up quite often in his films, French characters speaking. And often, sometimes they don't have any subtitles when they're speaking. I remember in Coffee and Cigarettes, because the same actor is also in one of the vignettes, along with Alex Stika, who's also another French actor. And when they're speaking French, there's no subtitles. It just says foreign language. At least that's what it says on Criterion. Yeah, so it's really interesting the way people communicate and what people perceive as loneliness versus how those characters actually are. Because, as I was saying, I feel like the mobsters are more lonely than Ghost Dog is. He seems very fulfilled in his life.
Well, it's interesting on that point, right? Because it's almost saying like words themselves don't matter. It's saying that in communication, it's inflection, it's tone, it's intent. I think that's what I guess they're trying to say about communication in Ghost Dog.
I think that runs throughout, even if we tie it back to Ghost Dog and Louis, who Ghost Dog works for Louis, and we see their origin story essentially, and why Ghost Dog is working for him. And I find the Louis character really interesting because at no point, we were talking about race relations and the racism of the mobsters. At no point does, at least I found that Louis doesn't use Ghost Dog's race against him, because you kind of assume that's going to be a huge thing. He does say some problematic stuff, but it's not as bad as some of the other characters do. But when he's explaining to his bosses what his relationship is to Ghost Dog and why he thinks it doesn't make sense to get rid of him because he's, completed his jobs. We never have to see him. He's basically a ghost, essentially. So there's that I want to talk about. And there's also the concept of when he says, what's his name? It's Ghost Dog. And he's trying to explain, well, a lot of gangsters say that, despite the fact that, Ghost Dog's not really a gangster. That's his name. That's the way he wants to go by. But in his way, that's the only way he can explain to these people why he has that name. And then, the Vargo character talks about, the indigenous people and their names. And then what I love about the way that scene ends is Sonny says, call these other people in, and they also have their names too. So it's just like there's the judgment that they originally placed, knowing that these characters also have these stage names, essentially. How do you feel about that in terms of the race relations in this film?
Oh, 100%. I want to get back to the Louis thing, because there were some interesting things you brought up there, but also I want to touch on the native influence, as you were talking with because the idea of titles, obviously, that is something that you could relate back to Native culture. You can relate it to Black culture, right? Especially with the rappers at the time. And I think that this point is even further made when we see the Native character who was in Dead Man on the roof with the pigeons, who gets shot later. I think that's Jarmusch's way of saying that, like, that struggle still exists today. And there's also this other struggle that's starting to experience the same things that those other people also experienced, right? So there's a camaraderie and there's a solidarity and an understanding that's unspoken, right? Because you don't see Ghost Dog say that to a Native person. Instead, it's from the mobster's perspective where they acknowledge that. To get back to the Louis thing, right? When I watch this, whenever I rewatch this movie, right, I always forget how long it is, right? Because there's a climax in the middle, right? There's the mansion thing, and then it drags out. And every time I watch it, I think to myself, I'm like, why is it like this way? And then I realize, oh yeah, Louis is the villain. Like Henry Silva is the fake villain. And the reason that Louis is the villain is because, we can get into the Rashomon question of whether or not he did save Ghost Dog later, but the whole plot comes down to Louis telling Ghost Dog to kill someone. Ghost Dog does it. Then the rest of the mobsters get mad at Louis. So then Louis pins it on Ghost Dog. So then Ghost Dog kills all of the mobsters except for Louis. And then Louis kills Ghost Dog out of essentially his pride. Obviously, plainly laying it out, it becomes pretty obvious, right? But I think that what it is it's like the insecurity of the Italian mobster in the face of the coming, essentially, African American gangs are going to take over the streets versus what the Italians were going to do. And there's the shifting of the crime that way, right? Then there's also the fact of culture and music in that sense. And then there's also the fact of like just the idea of the aggressive person who's going to take over, but then in the process ruin the original product, as exemplified through the Itchy and Scratchy cartoon at the end of the film. Bigger gun, bigger gun, bigger gun. The world blows up and we all die. Louis is representation of essentially this like deep-seated, hateful ideology that continues throughout generations. This idea that like we have to defeat our enemies through moral combat in order to get some kind of, personal recognition or pride. And at the end of the day, it's what Ghost Dog, the film, presupposes that's an unholy way to live. It's a shitty way to live. And I agree,
Yeah.
The way you should be living your life is, sleeping on a rooftop, reading a book, that also, I just a side note entirely. I love that there's that sequence where they have trouble sending the pigeon note, right? Like they're trying to catch the pigeon.
I know.
And they send it. And then when he finally gets the message, right, it's like, please talk to us. It's urgent. And he eats the note and he falls back. I think that's the whole movie in general. And I love it.
That is a great scene because it's like, I think that's the thesis to that character, right? That, seeing him lying down surrounded by pigeons and just so serene, because most of us would be kind of mortified at the thought of being surrounded by a bunch of pigeons, especially, both of us living in Toronto. And for some reason, people think pigeons are the enemy of the city, even though they seem very docile creatures. But
I'm okay with pigeons. Just keep the Canadian geese away.
They're violent. They're definitely violent. I like your thoughts on Louis because I definitely agree, and I hadn't read it that way. I definitely think in the end he is a villain, but I don't think I read it that way until it gets to the end piece. And I'm glad that you talked about how there is an ending that you think should be the ending. It would be the ending in any other film. He shoots everyone, and then okay, cool, he's good now.
It was the Tarantino movie.
Yeah. And you think that, and you're like, you look at the time, you're like, oh no, there's actually still another half an hour to this movie. What else is going to happen? You're like, okay, well, there's other people who are still there. Sonny is still there. So he's probably going to have to go get them. But that doesn't really matter, even though there is that really cool shot of him shooting Sonny through the sink, which every time I see it, I'm always just like, that's him being like, okay, I got to get a cool shot in. And I think it's very merited. But it is the showdown with Louis. And I love Ghost Dog saying, is this, your Western showdown at the end? What are you doing here? But the acceptance of knowing this is going to happen because he empties his guns beforehand. He leaves his money to Raymond. He knows what's going to happen because he knows that person. He knows, and he's accepting it. And when he gets shot, I think it's maybe in the first or second time, he's just like, it's fine. Like, I've seen what I needed to see in my life. I'm ready to move on. And it's a sad ending to it, but it is the samurai ending, right? I think it's that fate that is set up for that character.
Is it a samurai ending? That's my question. That's because in my mind, right, we've been watching a samurai film all throughout, right? And then right at the end, it becomes a Western. And it's because Louis wins. And if we think about this through this context of cultural media, we get a Western ending versus the samurai ending because the Western won and the gangster won and the mobster won. And for me, it's like, that's like one part of the story, right? Like that he won today, but then the girl reading the book at the end is the victory in the future, right? It's the idea of intellect prevailing overall, right? And that's how Ghost Dog Spirit's going to go move on. And also, like we've talked about this, right, in the sense of like the gangsters being so into like, the Looney Tunes cartoons and traditional media, right? But then when it comes to like Japanese film influence in Black culture, right? That is a very big thing. And it's something outside of Ghost Dog and is the reason why the Wu-Tang is the way that it is today, right? So I think that by Jarmusch putting all of those things into this, it's like meaningful in like several different layers that like it took me several times to kind of get through it, like you were saying before.
No, I agree. I agree. I think that ending with Louis is definitely a Western ending. I think the ending with the girl is where the samurai stuff comes back in. And I do want to talk about that ending because there's one specific scene that I have a bit of a visual issue with. And it's not the very end when she's reading the book. It's just before that when she picks up the gun to shoot Louis. I don't think it bothered me any other time but this watch where I was like, yes, she might have heard Raymond say that the guns were empty. I don't know that she's first of all, just as like as a side, I was like, Raymond, you need to move this girl aside. There's guns. You need to move this young girl aside. Why are you bringing her forward? She needs to be away from this. But then when she picks up the gun, I don't really necessarily know what Jarmusch is trying to say with that specific scene. I'm glad that it didn't end on that and that she is reading the book. And I don't think she's going to go the ghost dog route. Other than the philosophy version, I don't think she's going to go into a life of crime. At least I hope not. Her picking up the gun did upset me a little bit. I'm not sure what he's trying to say. Not that you know, but I'm wondering how you feel about that.
No, you're right. I like it. I don't know. I'm going to spitball as well, right? But at the same time, you bring up a great question, right? Because I agree with you, right? It's this kind of like moment where you're supposed to feel as though she could possibly kill Louis, right? And you even get that point where she clicks the gun and his body kind of twitches a bit, and you think that he got shot for a second, and he keeps going. I think that all on a craft level is executed perfectly. But then when it comes to its interpretation in the story, I have a bit of problems with it as well. You're right. In the sense of where it needs to be in the story, it's unnecessary at that point. We don't need to see her try to shoot him. You know, if anything, it would be better to see the ice cream driver do that, right? I feel like they're more of a yin and yang, right? Because they're often echoing each other. I think that what the film is trying to say is essentially violence is something that's passed down through generations, and this is the violence being stopped here, right? It's Ghost Dog saying, I fought, I'm the last one who's going to do it, my debt is done. Essentially, he's paid off his debt from the beginning of his journey. And because she has the same background as him, she's read all the same books as him, right? Her reading the Samurai Code going forward, right? That's just going to be brought to her battles every day, whether it be, what am I going to get the grocery store to? How am I going to get this apartment? Right. Like all of those things, those are transferable skills, not just for violence.
I think that's the most positive way to look at it. And I like that you said that's the reason why we hear that click. And I think because she realizes the gun is empty and that she could have potentially killed this guy, but thankfully didn't, that's where the violence will end for her. So I could see it. If I read it that way, I'm less upset about that specific scene because it's the only one that really I didn't love, but I do love that it ends with her reading and you could see in her eyes, this is something that's going to take a great effect on me. And I just love their dynamic. And I think it was really important to have that dynamic because we see the friendship with Raymond and that's great. But for him to have that nurturing relationship with a young girl, and it's not weird at all. It's very wholesome. He just wants to talk about books and he wants her to read them in her own time. He doesn't want to force them. He's like, when you read this, you let me know how you feel about it. And I think that's a really beautiful relationship. And I think it was really important for her as much as I think it was traumatic for her to be there and see him die. I think it was also important for her to see that and be like, I'm going to take parts of Ghost Dog's life and then the other part is not for me, thankfully.
That note in particular, right? You make so many friends throughout your life because of shared shared interests. And, I can't even tell you like the amount of age discrepancies, backgrounds, what have you, right? I've made like all kinds of friends with all kinds of things just because of the shared interests. And I think that that's what Jarmusch, his whole career is about. He's just kind of like, I really love, I don't know, in this case, samurai films, right? And because of that, he has this access to so many people who have those same interests and it goes out from there, right? I think Ghost Dog is like saying, the shared commonalities and the shared interests, those are the things that we hold deep and we hold care. And we should keep those connections close.
I agree. It's interesting when sometimes when I throughout the course of doing this podcast, there's always films that I've basically liked every film I've talked about. I've been lucky that way just because, I'm talking about directors I like. So chances are, like, sometimes when you talk about a film with someone else, your appreciation for it grows even more because you get to see other people's perspective on it. And with a film like this, I think it's so important to discuss. And I think it's a film that people talk about when they talk about Jarmusch, but it's not usually right top of mind. And it's part of the Criterion Collection, so there's more eyes on it. But I think it's really important to discuss with other people who have other life experiences, because that's what this whole film is about. It's different people with different life experiences coming together and chatting. So I'm interested to hear if there's anything we haven't chatted about that you want to bring up.
Oh yeah, there's a few things. Rashomon. We gotta talk about because there's the two different interpretations of how Ghost Dog saw the saving from Louis versus how Louis saw it, right? I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and I'll give my thoughts as well.
Yeah. So on this watch, I think I was a little bit more sympathetic to Louis before, things get into it, because I think that, and I think I maybe viewed it the same way Ghost Dog did, that he did save him from a situation that he didn't need to interject himself into, but he did. Whatever Louis' actual reason for doing that, don't think it really mattered to Ghost Dog. I think it gave him a new life to realize. I think at that point he thought he was done for. So he's reborn, and that's why he became the person that he ended up being, because Louis says it was like 4 years before he came and found him. So there was a lot of growth that happened within that time. And that's obviously when he became Ghost Dog, obviously. I think the way Ghost Dog views him is a lot more beautiful. And I think that he does think that he owes him because he gave him a new life, a new reason to live his life the way he's living it. And I could see that. I think most of us are like, you don't really need to give him anything. You could have just gone about your day, because who knows why he actually did that. But I think it's kind of beautiful the way that he's just like, well, I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to immerse myself in that life too much, because Louis also says he only gets paid once a year on the first day of autumn. They only communicate by carrier pigeon, which is absolutely insane to do. And I like the scene that you mentioned of them trying to wrangle the one pigeon and put it on. And he's just like, this paper's too small. Like, I can't write on it. Because it's just like, most of us would be like, what in the hell? How am I supposed to do any of this? We wouldn't know. So I think it's really interesting the way Ghost Dog views it versus Louis. I think he just is confused about it. And who knows what his original reason was, but he was like, well, this guy, it says he's indebted to me, so I'm going to use him, but I'm not going to push it because he's obviously very skilled. I don't want him coming after me. So I think he's just like, I only view him as this one thing. I don't really care about him outside of that. But curious to hear how you feel.
I guess to go off the Louis thing, just because that was where you just finished off. I think because the main difference between the two versions of it, right, is either the guy was always pointing the gun at Ghost Dog and Louis stepped in. That's Ghost Dog's version. Versus the guy beat up Ghost Dog with a pipe and then pulled the gun on Louis, and then Louis stepped. And what's interesting about the Louis version of the story, right, is that the gun was pulled on him. Therefore, it was like Ghost Dog brought him into that fight or something, right?
Yeah.
And like there's almost like a psychic thought for Louis' end that he's almost like a liability as much as he is something to exploit. I was brought in this thing to, stop this kid from getting beat up, right? That's Louis' approach, right? But then Ghost Dog's approach is like pro-humanist, optimist in the right way, right? In seeing the beauty of life, right? And like, we can pontificate on whether or not he was a pretty good fighter before that point, right? But it's clear that after this point, he really delved into the samurai stuff. He really delved into the Ghost Dog. So it was this action that gave him purpose. And I think that's another interesting thing to talk about in relation to this film as well, right? It's like there are these things that give us purpose. And realistically speaking, it could be anything. Ghost Dog is a hitman that's in the samurais, right? Like that's just such a weird combination of things, but it makes sense because that just intrinsically makes sense to him. And I feel like everyone is filled with that. Like someone could be walking down the street and they could be a DJ, right? Who knows, right? And they could also really be into the Roman Empire. All of these influences that all come together. And that's them, right? And I think that's the Rashomon thing helps bring that out as well.
That's, I think, what is so prevalent in Jarmusch's work is that he knows from just being himself that people are complex. I think that we think that a certain type of person has to only be into this, and you wouldn't expect someone from Ghost Dog's background to be into samurai cultures. And it's like, why not? What's stopping him? Absolutely nothing. So it's like humans are complex, and we're allowed to have different interests that are outside of what people think. So that's what I really like about this.
I was trying to think of like what movies you could compare Ghost Dog to, right? And I feel like currently, like it's a strange example, right? But I think it actually fits. I think the new Spider-Verse movies, like the Miles Morales ones, because it's this idea of like an unexpected version of Spider-Man, right? It's Miles Morales now instead of Peter Parker. And you also got this hip hop soundtrack, and it's all applied to a superhero film, right? Which is a different genre movie. I feel as though those are two different speeds, but it's also two different versions of this growing up in America as a Black person, right? Trying to make their way through a white world. And that's superhero world versus mobster world in Ghost Dog. Yeah. Robbie Mueller shot this movie.
Yes. I don't know why he's been in the background of my head and watching this, and I had it in my notes, completely forgot to bring it up. So I'm glad you did before we wrap that up, because yes, it's one of the later ones that he would have shot. It's on digital, and in contrast to the earlier Jarmusch stuff that he would have shot. And because I'm doing the Jarmusch, he's obviously now come up again. And I knew I said at the end of that series, I was like, don't worry, Mueller will be back, because I love his work. This film was shot so beautifully, and it just shows, a filmmaker who was so tied to film and how he's able to translate it. And what I find really interesting about this film is that it's shot in New Jersey, obviously, but it's a nameless city. And even like down to like the license plates, it always just says something it's not an actual state. And I was reading about that. They were just trying to avoid tying it to a specific city. They were just like, this is every man's sort of urban area in the specific eastern side of the States. We all figured it was probably New York, New Jersey. Turns out it was shot in New Jersey. But I love the way that he shoots the city in this. I don't know how you feel about the work versus his other work with Jarmusch.
Yeah, he's somebody who really plays around with the natural lighting. And whenever I think about Ghost Dog, right, he's got these really sleepy, dark, like evening vibes to it, right? You've got lots of blacks, purples, blues. The shading is really wonderful in this movie. The thing with Mueller is he really wants to make it feel as though it's happening in the moment, which has like almost like a French New Wave vibe to it, or in the sense that it's got like a lower budget, or it's got like we're actually at this location. I think Jarmusch's films work really well for that, because he's somebody who will, he talks about how he'll drive to a location and he'll spot other locations and they'll go film other things there. Like he's one of those types of filmmakers. Having a cinematographer like that who can just like, okay, we're going to sit up here, we're going to just make whatever, boom. I think that's the perfect kind of collaborator for Jarmusch. But then for the look and the feel of the film itself, I spoke earlier about how the music has this floating feel to it, and I feel like the cinematography affects that as well. There are some flourishes I'm not a fan of. I guess you could call them editing. Things like the kind of like faded action effect when he's like moving his hand and his arm is making like that little. I'm not a fan of that stuff, right? I think that's the closest Jarmusch gets to Tarantino level.
Yeah, it felt dated, especially on this watch. I was like, okay, that's the 90s, early 2000s right there. But yeah,
it makes up for it when like the mobster gets up and he has the heart attack. Like that makes up for that. But
no, I love their collaboration. It's always special when a director and cinematographer have this history together, and you see how they've evolved together and where they've come. And Mueller is a huge one because he had relationships with not only Jarmusch, but like Wenders and Lars von Trier, and it's like, imagine that he has like a huge body of work under his belt that he left us with. So I'm always pro everything that he does, and it's nice to see where he, ended up towards the later part of his career and just never lost his touch at all.
I feel like we need to talk more about them. I don't know why
Yeah, talk about them because I'm really not familiar with their work.
You're not familiar with the Wu-Tang Clan? No? Oh,
No.
36 Chambers, listen to that album when you get the chance. If you like the martial arts films, right? They've got like the
Okay.
full sampling of like classic martial arts films in there. And then even going further, all of the solo works from all of the different Wu-Tang Clan members, they became obsessed with sampling other kinds of exploitation and genre films in their work. And when you look at the history of like rap music, this is like the first time where you really get movies in rap music is with the Wu-Tang Clan. So I think that when it comes to the RZA's involvement with this movie in particular, right, it's unexpected to have like a full hip hop produced score. But also I think that it's talking to this like two different artists who are in love with the exact same type of movie. Right. And it's just like
Yeah.
and when it comes to RZA, like as a producer, he kind of started to drift away from his influences later on. But as a figure today, right, like he still is so obsessed with the martial arts, with the exploitation films, and he still makes movies like that. So it's funny because, we associate RZA with the Wu-Tang Clan, but really he's just a martial arts fan. Like he's just a martial arts nerd, right? Like he was in in that Bob Odenkirk action film Nobody, right? Just because he likes martial
Oh
arts,
yeah.
like he'll do it, right? Those Man with the Iron Fist films, not all that great, but I'm glad he's having fun.
I mean, yeah, that's all you can ask for from an artist. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I know it's obviously a huge part of this film, and he's worked with members in previous films as well. Admittedly, I am just so, I don't know if far removed is the best way, but I'm so unfamiliar with hip hop. It's just
Mm.
not the genre that I gravitate towards. Obviously, I know who they are
Mm.
and I know the members' names.
Mm.
I couldn't tell you a single song, which is probably very embarrassing, but I do know their importance. So it's interesting to hear that background for you on their work and just the influences that they have, especially the one member. I think that's really cool.
I would definitely highly recommend you check out their stuff if you can, just because they're
Yeah.
like wildly entertaining. Like it's
Okay.
they've got like that classic like boom bap sound that you'd hear in New York, like so the beats are really hard hitting, and then you've got like people like Old Dirty Bastard who's just like yelling on tracks. So like that, I find that stuff is awesome. Where he's just
Okay.
making up a verse on the spot. But this kind of like fluidity. I love that in music.
It's one of those groups that I know of people who are probably more into like the punk stuff that I like, but they love
Mhm.
Wu-Tang Clan too because there's kind of a punk sensibility, I think,
There is. Yeah,
to their
100%.
music. So I think they translate. I need to actually sit down and do it. And I'm sure there's probably songs that I'd be like, oh yeah, I know this song. I just
Mm.
probably didn't associate with them. So that'll be my assignment for the week to go and actually sit down and listen to because it's time, I think. I'm interested to hear getting into the last segment what you would recommend as a starter from Jarmusch because I know that you've watched a lot of his films. What way you're approaching it? Are you approaching it as someone who a blank slate? Or are you approaching it as trying to, cater it to a specific person as what you would recommend for a first film and where they should start off with his career?
It's a tough question, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like Jarmusch, while his thematic focuses are rather linear, I find that the modes in which he tells stories can vary drastically from
Yeah.
project to project. But if we were to like essentially classify like the main ideas of what a Jarmusch narrative is, right? Like there are anthology films, sort of. There
Mm-hmm.
are identity narratives, right? Which is something that I would say that Ghost Dog and I would say Broken Flowers and I'd say The Only Lovers Left Alive. Those are like identity plays. And then there are also like the genre breakdowns, right? Which I would also say Ghost Dog is in relation to The Dead Don't Die. Now, all of this is to say that like if you're a fan of a particular kind of movie, right? Like if let's say you're more into a comedy, right? You could watch like A Night on Earth or
Mm-hmm.
Dead Don't Die, and you can enjoy that. If it were up to me, and if I were to choose what your viewers would watch for their first Jarmusch film, I think I'd go with Down by Law or Ghost Dog, one or the other. Because like obviously we've talked all this time on Ghost Dog, so you know why I'd say it about that one. And then when it comes to Down by Law, there's kind of like a free, wild feeling to this movie, right? Like it's slower as well, right? But there's a lot of fun and it's rambunctious, and it's almost like the antidote to "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" So I think that if people like that movie and want less singing and more dark humor, I think that Down by Law is a great gateway to get into more Jarmusch films.
I agree. I mean, I usually with series, I usually have the same answer. My answer was Down by Law as well. It's funny because I think when I got into Jarmusch, it would have been around the time I was entering school or was already in school, and I started from the beginning. But I think it was Down by Law that really was like, okay, I really vibe with this, and it's one of the very first Criterions I ever bought. I think it might have been the first Criterion I bought, and I think it just sets up everything that he has to offer. And yes, he's deviated from that, but you still get at the core, it's basically just guys hanging out and there's something they're trying to figure out. And I love watching the three of them in that film. And I think I never have a bad time talking about or watching Down by Law. So I think that's probably what I recommend. And then from there, I'm like, if you like Down by Law, you can really just go any route on the Jarmusch, front. And I think you'll get something out of what he's offering.
People will always say that like they're just people in rooms talking, but he chooses the best people. These are the most interesting people. You got Tom Waits, you got Roberto Benigni, the RZA, we've already talked about Tilda Swinton, all these crazy big talents, right? Who are constantly in his films. If they're too slow for you, at least they're like people that you're probably chances are going to like, right? So I have to say if anyone's like on the fence, they should jump.
Exactly. It is also the casting, and that's a huge part of being a director of just, getting the people down. And even like all the people you mentioned, also Bill Murray, who everyone's familiar with, and especially later Bill Murray, where he was actually playing, characters outside of what you were expecting. And his work is great with Jarmusch. So I definitely agree. But, on the Ghost Dog front, if you're going to pair this, I know we've actually talked about a few films that you think are similar. If you're making a double bill, you can give me more than one film with the double bill, triple bill, and so on. What films would you pair it with, and what's the reasoning behind the pairings?
I'm going to give you two options, essentially. I feel like there are two ways you can go with a Ghost Dog double feature. Okay, so with the first option, I would say this is like the preferable one. This would be the one that I would say, like, if you want like a solid night out at the movies, you should watch Ghost Dog with The Only Lovers Left Alive. I feel like those two movies would be like a nice yin and yang to each other there. Mostly because, while The Only Lovers Left Alive is kind of a horror film on paper, it's more so a like romance, and it's more so deeply contemplative and really funny. I think that pairs very nicely with what Ghost Dog's doing as well, right? Where it sells you on one kind of narrative and then it's really funny and just kind of like stewing. The other option for a double feature would be The Dead Don't Die and Ghost Dog. And the reason being is I think that The Dead Don't Die was trying to be Ghost Dog. I think it was really trying to be Jarmusch recapturing that magic. And the RZA is also in Dead Don't Die. And a classic horror director, Larry Fessenden, has a cameo there, which is clearly supposed to be the version of the RZA in Ghost Dog with Jarmusch and Dead Don't Die. So like these same things are trying to be accomplished there, right? But Dead Don't Die does such a worse job at integrating the comedic elements and making the stakes actually feel tangible. And at the end of the day, you get the worst side of Jarmusch, where it's like you've got all these interesting people, but they don't have anything interesting to do. I give those two options because like I'm sure you're the same way, right? Where like I like watching good movies, but I also like watching bad movies, right? And I think that when you watch a good movie versus when you watch a bad movie, you can learn equally as much. That's not to say Dead Don't Die is a bad movie. I just think it's not as successful as his others.
No, I think that's perfectly put. I also agree. Like sometimes I watch something, especially certain genres, like horror is like quite often that genre where you're like, I know this is not good in quotes, but you can see the benefits or, why other people have done it better. And still, it can be a fun time. Like, I watch a lot of bad horror films or, action films, and you're like, well, I still had fun. It's like, it's not great. And there's people who've done it much better, but it's still worth watching. I think everything is worth watching. And I my philosophy is that nothing's bad. It's just things that you like and dislike because everyone it's subjective. So I love that approach of having both of those and seeing, what he has done better in other films. Yeah, the ones that I picked, I think the obvious one, get that out of the way, was The Samurai, which you already mentioned. I think there's a lot of influences with Jean-Pierre Melville. But the ones that I thought of, they both happen to be released in 1968, oddly enough. But the first one I thought of, and I was thinking of Ghost Dog as this character who is a little bit silent inward, and he's very focused in his job and what his task. And I thought of The Great Silence, the Sergio Corbucci film in 1968, and the parallels between those two protagonists. Obviously, one is actually silent. He cannot speak. But I like the way they approach their tasks and maneuver. And I think it'd be interesting to watch Ghost Dog with a Western and have those two together. And the other one I thought of also in 1968 was one called Hell in the Pacific. It's John Boorman and it stars Lee Marvin and Toshiro Mifune. And what I like about that and the parallels is there's two guys, one's an American, one's Japanese. They've both been stranded and they're stranded together alone on this island. Without giving too much away, there's obviously conflicts between them because of the time. It's America versus Japan. And they have their very set ways in how they navigate the world. And it's both of them just together because it's literally just the two of them, the whole film. Such great performances. I love this movie and I love the way they are navigating their cultures and how they learn and grow to eventually understand one another, despite the fact that they cannot speak to one another. And I think that's a parallel to Ghost Dog and stuff in that. So I think that those would be interesting ones to pair Ghost Dog with.
I had not heard of that John Boorman film. I'm probably going to watch
it tonight.
Like it. Yeah, because I watched Point Blank for the first time like weeks ago. Love that movie. Like I really fell in love with that. I realized with the recommendation, I recommended two Jarmusch films, right? I'll throw in Museo. I didn't talk about that at the beginning. So I'll throw in Museo. 2018's Museo is a fantastic film. I think that would pair nicely with Ghost Dog. Main reason being it's about these two Mexican young adults. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to make some cash. So they decide they're going to break into the Mexican City Anthropological Museum, right? So they steal a bunch of old, like classic paintings, like jars, like old art pieces integral to Mexican culture and history. And what I love about this film is it starts off and it has a very Western feel to it. It's purposefully evoking filmmakers like Michael Mann and Paul Thomas Anderson. And then as the film transitions and the plot has a sharp change in focus, so too do the influences change. And it starts to become more reflective of Mexican cinema and filmmaker and like television and Mexican films made at the time, which is 1985. What I love about this film is similar to Ghost Dog. It's about how people in a time and a space try to take what they've consumed and leave an impact in the world. In Ghost Dog's case, he wants to make a positive change. And in Museo, they're selfish and they do stuff without fully thinking things through. And I think that those two in conversation with one another would actually make for a pretty insightful conversation if we're going to talk about cultural handing things down through generations, as well as what people choose to focus on as history moves on.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. And I do recall hearing about it when it came out, but I don't think I knew what it was about. I just remember hearing the name. So I'm going to add that to my list because it sounds really interesting.
It's really good.
Well, that's something to look forward to. I'm always looking for new recommendations. So I love that. I think we did a good job chatting about Ghost Dog. I think, as we were saying, it's a film that should be discussed and everyone's going to have their own interpretation and thoughts on it. So I hope that anyone listening goes back and rewatches it and sees things that they didn't notice before, because I think it's accessible enough. It's on Criterion Channel, and I think I remember from our last chat that we both talked about being pro pirating, so you can definitely download it.
That's my favorite streaming service.
Right? Same. But thank you so much for joining me again. I had a blast chatting about it, and I hope that you want to come again. We'll chat about another director, but thank you so much chatting about Ghost Dog today.
Thank you so much for having me again, Felicia. It's always a pleasure. I love talking about this film, and I can't wait to talk about more with you.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia Maroney, with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode on coffee and cigarettes.